So this lecture is on virus transmission, or how do we get infected by a virus. So the virus cycle is to infect a host cell, make more virus, which includes genome replication and gene expression, get out of the host, exit, and redo, and infect again. Okay. One of the issues viruses have to deal with is when they are outside of the host in the environment. So remember, we have two general classes of viruses: the naked, which is just a capsid and genomic material, and the enveloped, which is capsid, genomic material, and then a membrane around it. So enveloped viruses are much more, or I should say, are much less stable in the environment because of the membrane. There's a risk of what I call drying out. So if they lose their membrane, then they're no longer infectious, because the spikes here on the membrane or the outside of the membrane is what can attach to the host cell. So naked viruses are much more stable in the environment, and then their stability just depends on the specific virus. Okay. So when you're thinking about viruses, I want you to think about the connection between how the virus is transmitted and the cell types it infects. There's two kinds of transmission. Horizontal transmission is same species to same species, like human to human, dog to dog, mouse to mouse. Okay. We'll talk about zoonotic transmission, and that's when it changes species. Okay. So how can we transmit viruses person to person? Well, you can do it directly through contact. So sex, there are STDs or STIs, sexually transmitted infections, that are caused by viruses such as human papillomavirus and HIV. You can transmit through blood, things like Ebola and HIV. Injection, also again, that's really talking about sharing needles. Kissing, so Epstein-Barr virus was always called the kissing virus. So there's virus in your saliva. Bites, again, would be saliva-based viruses. And then there's the indirect, which means you're not directly contacting, but it is from this person to this person that the infection passes. So most common way is aerosols, when you sneeze, when you cough. For the longest time, and I think still, they worry of an HIV person spitting on someone, because there has been shown low levels of HIV virus in the saliva. Skin, urine, feces can all contaminate the environment. So human papillomavirus can be transmitted skin to skin, but it's usually more direct. But sometimes you can shed things into the environment, and they sit on something called a fomite, which I'll show you in a minute, and that can infect. This is much less common, except for things like polio that hangs around in the environment. The common cold will hang around on fomites for a little while. And what's really happening to this person is that they're inhaling or ingesting from the contaminant. So this is like placing your hand on something and then grabbing food or rubbing your eyes. So this ingestion I like to put in quotes because it could be through the eyes, touching your mouth. Through your nose. Many viruses are passed through what we call the fecal oral route. Let me see if I have that. No. And what this means is that the virus is replicating somewhere in your intestinal tract, and it's coming out in fecal matter, contaminating the environment. So that could be water, food, or contaminating fomites, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then the person is going to somehow get this orally. So eating contaminated water or food, touching something again, and touching your mouth and hands. So oral, right to your gut system, out through the fecal route. Poor personal hygiene, poor sanitation. This can also be hepatitis A, so polio, rotavirus, Norwalk, which is these are the stomach flus, other enteroviruses. Okay, so like I said, horizontal transmission by aerosol is probably, I'm spelling it wrong, most common, easiest way, and the smaller the viruses, travel further. Okay. So things like Ebola's has a size of 970 by 80 nanometers. Because remember, Ebola's this long, whoops. All right, so this long guy. Okay. Influenza, the flu, is 80 to 120 nanometers. So it's much smaller. It can travel much farther. Measles are 100 to 200 nanometers. And even smaller is rhinovirus, which is really the common cold. That little guy's only about 30 nanometers. So it can travel very small and very small droplets. So it's not like someone has to sneeze directly on you. Look, we're talking over 6 feet here, transmission. Fomites are anything inanimate. Okay, so anything you can touch, your desk. If you have to use the computer lab, common keyboards have been shown to be one of the dirtiest spots anywhere, with everybody touching all those keys. All these surfaces in your house can harbor viruses, bacteria, other microbes. Hand washing is great if you wash your hands well. If not, as soon as that air hits, you're spreading microbes everywhere. Same with toilet flushing. You can see there's still even space. So they've got new toilet seats that come down further. Obviously, you don't even have that in public restrooms. So as soon as you start flushing, lots of stuff gets aerosolized. The biggest spread of disease is touching your eyes, nose, mouth with your hands. So this is showing you influenza, and these are bacteria, and RSV is a respiratory virus, and yeast and other bacteria. So the best protection is just to wash your hands. I was at a dance competition last weekend and took a picture of this. It's all over all the bathrooms. So stomach illness, whoops, most likely a virus. So kids going into the bathroom, and obviously not all have great sanitation, and just the mass of people in there. Yeah, so doing a lot of hand washing that weekend. Vertical transmission is mother to child. And there are three types or three ways of vertical transmission. So during pregnancy, in utero, right, there are some microbes that can cross the placenta. We used to have an acronym, TORCH, which stood for Toxoplasma and other, rubella, I think CMV, I can't remember all of them. But unfortunately, it's way more than TORCH now. And I'll show you a slide in just a minute. Transmission during labor and delivery. So as the child passes through the birth canal, it starts to be colonized by normal flora, primarily bacteria and some yeast, but viruses can also be transmitted. And then there are some viruses that can be transmitted through breastfeeding. So I started to compile a list. Transplacental means it's crossing. The placenta, these ones in the kind of pink, are the viruses. There are other microbes, both protozoa and bacteria. And you can see that this list just keeps growing on viruses that they're finding. So here's Zika, one of the ones that has been in the news lately. Enteroviruses, I put an asterisk. They're not thought to cross the placenta, but they've seen high instances of miscarriage and neurodevelopment issues if the mom's infected while she's pregnant. Herpes, hepatitis B, HIV can be transmitted during birth, and then there are some that can even be transmitted in breast milk. This is a huge issue in developing countries where they don't have the choice of feeding babies formula. Epstein-Barr virus in a region of Africa, which we talked about, can cause a lymphoma, a cancer. They're seeing high rates of childhood cancer caused by Epstein-Barr virus. They think it's being passed on to the infants through the breast milk from the mom, but they're not willing to advise against breastfeeding because then the children wouldn't get any nutrition. Another type of transmission is vector-borne. So these are your biting insects. So the reservoir down here, a reservoir is a natural host where the microbe does not cause disease or not cause more than a mild disease. Virus does not cause disease. So the virus is happy there. It replicates, it makes more virus, and then it's transmitted by one of these biting insects, feeding usually a blood meal off of the reservoir host, and then transmitting that to a second host. So you can think of this also as a zoonotic disease, but it's got a middleman. It's got an intermediate. Notice that it's not transmitted person to person. So that's one of the interesting things about like West Nile virus that we had in this country 10, 15 years ago. We knew it was coming from wild birds and mosquito bites. Luckily, there was no transmission human to human. So the human is called a dead end host for many of these, if it does not replicate to such high levels that it's going to be picked up by the mosquito and transferred again. Okay, so you can see this X here. So West Nile does not replicate to high enough levels in an infected person that the mosquito would pick it up from this person and, whoops, transmit it to another. That's not true for all vector-borne transmissions, but if you see the term dead end host, that's why. All right, so I just wanted to show you some pictures of these cute little mosquitoes. Actually, I totally dislike mosquitoes, but yeah, part of our ecosystem. So different mosquitoes can harbor different parasites, and of course in this class we're talking specifically about viruses. So the Aedes mosquitoes here, ones that were primarily found in tropical regions, and I'll show you in a minute, their habitat has expanded as we have climate change happening and things are warming up. So Aedes, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, albopictus, can transmit things like Zika and dengue virus and chikungunya. Aedes aegypti can also transmit dengue and chikungunya and Zika, and it's the primary vector for yellow fever. Oh, I wanted to say that this guy also, not that it's a virus, but it can, we had talked a little bit about helminths, the little microscopic worms. So it can transmit a little worm that causes elephantitis in humans. The worm is a filarius. Anyways, just kind of interesting. So these guys can transmit helminths and protozoa as well. Anopheles is the malaria, which is not a virus. Plasmodium is a protozoa, but you might have heard of Anopheles viruses. Zika has now been found to be carried by Anopheles. Zika has also, this virus, been found in colics, which is the main one for West Nile, and other types of encephalitis viruses. So there's lots of work being done to try to figure out how to control mosquito populations, or how to make mosquitoes less able to transmit viruses. This page is just from your textbook, again, talking about different types of biting insects and the different viruses they can transmit. I want to make one point here, in that some of these vectors are called mechanical vectors. which means all they're doing is transmitting the microbe. There's also biological vectors. And the reason they're called biological is that there's some type of replication of the virus that's required for transmission. So lots of these viruses actually replicate inside the biting insect. Gets to a much higher level of virus, and then it's transmitted. So these arboviruses mean they're arthropod-borne, so they are transmitted by biting insects. And so this map is just showing how the range of vectors has increased as our climate increases. So you can see things are moving up. These different types are just talking about whether the mosquito lives seasonally or year-round. So these are seasonal. These are year-round. Oops. Right. And you can see that we're getting lots of seasonal further and further north. Okay, zoonotic transmission. This is the final type of transmission I want to talk about. This means it's going from animal to people, and more directly than through a vector, okay, like a biting insect. So there are steps that have to they have to take care of to steps that they have to go through in order to adapt to a new host. Okay, and we're seeing this happen more and more due to climate change, in global traveling, and some exotic dining, like eating different types of wild animals. I think that's how some of these zoonotic diseases have come across. So go ahead and look at those stages. They're kind of interesting. And then the last thing I just want to say about zoonotic transmission is it accounts for about 75% of emerging diseases. Okay, so these new things that spring up on us are usually coming from mainly wild, but sometimes domesticated animals. And it's really mainly viral diseases that are showing up. And so we will talk about this. We'll do some zoonotic paper for our last paper. But know that bacteria can be transmitted zoonotically, like Lyme disease. Protozoas can be transmitted zoonotically, Toxoplasma, Giardia, and prions, which we never got to talk about, which are not viruses. They're just crazy proteins. Those also can be transmitted zoonotically. And so here's just a list of some viruses. Again, their reservoir, where they're found, how they're transmitted, mostly through mosquito bites here, but some direct contact. And then if you want to read a cool book this summer, Spillover is all about zoonotic diseases, and this guy kind of goes with people figuring out how did these diseases jump, both viral and bacterial, jump from animals to humans. All right, that's it.